Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. Good morning. My name is Robin. I'm one of the fellows that helped organize this conference. It's wonderful to see you all. Thank you so much for giving us your Fridays. Thank you so much to the panel for being here. We're really, really grateful and excited about this. So I'm a PhD candidate in the Marine Science and Conservation Department. My research is about social conflict related to aquaculture development and competing priorities for how we use coastal space. And I'm really excited today. I've invited Grant and Anshali to this panel, and you'll learn more about each of them from their own mouths shortly, and I'll pass it over to Sam.
Thank you, Robin, for starting us off on the first panel. My name is Sehim Park, and I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate in art history, and visual studies, and a global justice and equity fellow. My research is titled Imaging Comfort Women, and I work on the images of representing sexual violence in Korean contemporary visual culture. And I invited Mark and Eileen to be our panelists. So our panel today is titled Multidisciplinary Understandings of Equity and Justice. And this panel developed from an organic conversation between an art historian, myself, and Robin, a marine social scientist, about how offering a single definition for justice and equity is impossible. The lack of a concrete definition is a challenge for enacting equity and justice, but it is also necessary for enabling communities to define their own needs. And in this panel, we explore the multiple working definitions of justice in our research and teaching practices. And this panel brings together scholars from various disciplines at Duke University to explore approaches and challenges to defining and fostering equity. So how does one define justice and equity from one's own discipline and its methods? What is the operational definition of justice and equity you use in scholarly practices of research and teaching? And what are the challenges and debates are scholars grappling with in one's own discipline around equity and justice? So we really wanted to create a space for conversation, interdisciplinary conversation about shared challenges and opportunities in advancing equity and justice.
Great. Sure. So we're each just going to say a word about why we invited these panelists. So I invited Grant because he has an array of experience with community-based research in a lot of different settings, and he's thought a lot about incorporating equity into both his research and his teaching and pedagogy. And most recently, he's been involved in a federal government initiative to bring equity into ocean governance conversations, and I think that's a really interesting story to tell as well. And then I invited Anshali because we hadn't actually met before today, but I wanted to find someone who is working in the health equity space and in public health, because I think public health has been thinking about these issues in a real way for a lot longer than the environmental sciences, and I think we have a lot to learn from them. And Anshali's research draws on so many different theoretical fields, and she's so multidisciplinary herself, and so I thought that lens that she uses in her own work would be a really perfect addition to this panel for how we actually go about conceptualizing equity.
So let me introduce my panelists. Eileen Chow is an associate professor of the practice in Chinese and Japanese cultural studies at Duke University, and she's also one of the founding directors of Story Lab at Duke University. And I invited Eileen because I was able to hear about her teaching practices and community-engaged collaborative projects outside the classroom. So I didn't take her class, but I was also able to hear about her teaching practices through various events at Duke University, but also on social media. And so I'm a little fangirling here a little bit. And I read a piece on Duke Magazine asking how did you get here today, but also her practice of writing in community. So they have deeply resonated with me. So I was curious to hear Eileen speak about those practices. And Mark Olson is Associate Professor of the Practice of Visual and Media Studies in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at Duke University, and a founding member of several arts and humanities initiatives at Duke that borrow from and innovate upon the lab model of the sciences on the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Research Lab and other labs at Duke. And I was actually a grader for his undergraduate course that's called Visual Culture of Medicine in my very first year entering the PhD program at Duke. And I was amazed by the breadth of visual culture he brings in, but also his teaching practices of drawing the diverse student body to actively participate in the classroom.
So we'll go ahead and get started. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with asking each panelist to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And I'll sort of keep track of time. But tell us who you are, how you define equity and justice in your own work, and what sort of tools, frameworks, or methods do you use to research and think about equity. And Eileen, if it's all right, we'll start with you and work our way down. And here's that.
Hi, thank you so much, Robin, for putting together this panel, and thank you all for being here. So much to say, a little bit of time, and so thank you for fangirling me, because I fangirl you right back. I've heard lots about your dissertation in progress, and a lot of people have said wonderful things about it, and so excited to meet everyone here. And so how did you get here today? As I mentioned, this is actually a question I posed on the first day of my Chinatown's class, and I'll circle back to why I asked this question, but part of, to respond to Robin's question about equity and justice, I think sometimes those of us in the humanities spend do a lot of somersaulting to justify why we exist, but also, what do we have to say in this kind of community engagement space, or equity space, or justice space, and instead of sort of trying to plead that case, I think of it as classrooms are communities. And I think that by modeling what a community in a classroom could be like, I'm actually also modeling what a community could be like. And so that's part of how I think about going forward in my teaching and my practices. So I also mentioned that I'm one of the founding directors of Story Lab. Story Lab, like, with a lot of Mark's projects as well, were these Franklin Humanities Institute sponsored humanities labs that try to use the science model and give humanities project. I feel, to be honest, there was a little bit of fetishizing of the science lab, but we took some good stuff from science labs, which is, of course, thinking that projects should be collaborative, projects should be maybe transient too, right? Like that they can have beginnings and ends rather than I will spend 25 years working on this one corpus of poetry, right? And so, that also you can involve undergrads, graduate students, faculty, staff as parts of your team to do these projects. So I do think that Story Lab was very built on that, and the idea of Story Lab was called No Story is Told Alone, and the idea that communities coalesce around text, whether it be a canonical work like Homer's The Odyssey, or around a TV show, my recent favorite, Our Flag Means Death, but like that you have people who will talk about it, enact it, model themselves about it, push against it, ban it, etc., but that communities do have conversations, and really important and really material ones around text. And so that was the kind of goal of Story Lab. Another thing that we were very proud of doing Story Lab, and we're about to launch Story Lab 2 with friends in the arts, actually in music and dance. But Story Lab 1 was really, one, not to be Anglocentric, since we were two Asianists and a classicist, and who were the founding directors. Two was to really incorporate staff, and we had a lot of Duke staff members, including custodial staff as well as kitchen staff, who joined our nightly writing sessions, and people were, and produced, fiction out of it. The third is not to have a kind of boundary between canonical and non-canonical, and so we had a fandom research group, for example, and we also had many outreach projects, including teaching kids in local schools about storytelling. So that's kind of the Story Lab, and I think in some ways, just because my own interest of fifth outshoe was this long-term interest in building Asian American studies in the South, Asian American diaspora studies at Duke, which was founded as a program a few years ago, is the first such program in the South, US South. And I felt like that was how do you make stories legible, how do you tell stories of people, of groups and peoples that are not usually archived and collected, and so oral history and discussion. So my Chinatown's class right now this week is on Chinese foodways, and they are in fact all fanning out all around the area, collecting oral histories of various Chinese restaurants in the Triangle, and probably like bugging everybody to death. But I think that is really part of both the ethos of Story Lab, but also ethos of my teaching. So quickly, a few minutes, I'll just tell you about why I say, how did you get here today? And by the way, I have index cards here if you want to play with them and do it yourself. But this is a question I pose to my students on the first day of class I teach, on this class called Global History of Chinatowns. And in the class, we learn about things like the crossroads of race and place, and whys and hows of immigration pathways and patterns, and also, Chinatowns, which are always a bit, kind of, they're both points of arrival and points of of departure, they're spaces of protection, but they're also spaces of inclusion and segregation. They're temporary shelter for recent arrivals and a means of building community. And, but more than learning about the specific history of the Chinese diaspora around the world, it's meant to actually guide students in thinking about what makes any community a community, including the ones to which they themselves belong. And Chinatowns are communities that are built by strangers when they need one another to survive. So there's a lot of imagined kinship and how they might thrive in a new place, which is a little bit like a college campus with different levels of privilege. But it's about strangers who come together to work, to live, to love, and in many cases, sometimes suffer violence together. And so when I asked them, I said, how did you get here today? I tell them to draw a picture, because I figure Duke students are usually fairly articulate and very comfortable with written oral expression. That's how they got into Duke. But most people were discouraged by some third grade teacher with a polite frown about how you draw. So, I know some of you are probably masters, but most people feel a little awkward, right? So I give them 90 seconds, say, draw the picture of how you got to this classroom today. And one of the things I do that is because I assume nobody was born in the classroom. So this does not put people like in that kind of strange immigration conversation about, tell us your ancestors or origins, or because, of course, pathways are not usually simple, they're not usually linear, and they're often forced and involuntary. So why should we assume that people's origin stories are more important than how they arrive? And so to focus on the here, now, today is part of the exercise. The drawing is to say, also, if you can't tell a story of who you are, who are you? And so language, if I switch language now, if I, 如果我开始现在用中文跟你说话, if I suddenly switch languages, some of you would smile and know what I'm talking about. The rest of you might tune me out, and some of you might feel anxious. And so the idea of drawing as a kind of conduit for telling your story is to challenge you thinking about the difficulty of communication. I usually ask them then to pair with someone in the class they didn't come to class with, so not a roommate, not a friend, and they will then try to decipher each other's stories. And that is the first step of building a community. So these are things that I do. This is the kind of thing I do in class. Also, because I do a lot of these kinds of things in class, I want to start doing it the first day. So basically, if you hate this mode of teaching, you can leave. So this is good practice, because the Chinatown's class, as I mentioned, we're doing ethnographies right now, but we also conclude with a 3-week gameplay, role-play game, scripted that I wrote, in which they have all different stakes within a fictional Chinatown space, from real estate investors, community activists, to academics, and they are basically rehearsing all the work of the first 9 weeks. And the reason I developed this game was frankly because when I moved to Duke, I realized most of my students, while talented and brilliant and intelligent and well-read, are basically suburban middle-class professional kids, right? So, and so they, when I first used to talk about like urban geography, urban space, gentrification, none of them really had any sense of what that was about. They always would say, build another building. And I'm like, well, okay, that shows that you did not live in a very crowded urban space. But so the game is also to get them to review the first 9 weeks of material, which is reading about history, sociology, anthropology, about Chinatown's histories and migration histories, but to embody it. So they have to play a particular kind of persona, a particular kind of role, to be able to really both marshal their intellectual arguments and readings, but to embody them. And I do think that, as some, this is part of Story Lab, that gameplay, role play, while sometimes with its pitfalls, still has a kind of possibility of making you see outside yourself, if not only temporarily. And so part of the role play, which they're about to get into, is to ask, what are the stakes in the community, but also what are the stakes in the community for people who are different. And just finishing up with the, how did you get here today? I think one, of course, is to emphasize arrival rather than departure, the alliances and communities you make in the here and now rather than the past, but also that our paths of travel and means of conveyance is entirely different. For a middle-class kid with fellowships, grants, Duke has many, many exciting summer grants for students, couple $1,000s to travel to Asia and back, prohibited but not prohibitive, right? Expensive but not prohibitive. For someone with non-documented, led by a snakehead from rural village in China, who then ends up owing a lot of debt to the person leading them through circuitous paths, often recently through the Panama Canal and through the global south, and then up, from the southern border into the U.S. That is a journey that is not only physically perilous, legally perilous, but also usually runs you a debt of $80,000, even if you land successfully in New York City or LA to find work. And so I want to make the point that how you get here today is entirely different based on your own subjectivity and your position and what you have access to. And so do I teach global justice and equity in the way that perhaps people in other fields who are really do? But I think that even in the humanities, one is able to bring that kind of knowledge, awareness, embodiment into the classroom. And so that is kind of how I think I teach. And I tell them, don't be strangers, This is where you begin to find kin and community.
Is that better? Great. Morning again. Thanks to everyone for inviting me. Thank you, Robin, and thanks to the panel for putting this on. My name is Grant Murray. I'm a marine natural resource sociologist. So that's a long way of saying I think about people in marine and coastal environments. So I do a lot of work on governance questions, on social impact questions, on human dynamics questions, and behaviors in the natural environment. Robin asked me to come here and talk about how we understand equity and justice in our field, and I had to think about that a little bit, because in one way we've been using different terms for thinking about equity for a long time. So governance is one of the things I mentioned. We, for a long time, have been thinking about the structures and processes of decision making. Who gets to sit at the table? What does the table look like? How do resources get allocated? What voices are heard? What voices are not heard? Who has power? Who does not have power? How is that power expressed in decision-making for? And then what are the outcomes for both the people and the environments that we're concerned about? We might call that procedural equity now. This is a new term that I've been learning as a useful sort of umbrella term, equity, to think about these things. But governance is a long-standing field of inquiry for us. I've specifically been doing that in a lot of different contexts, but including indigenous ones, where we think a lot about entirely different value sets sometimes, different worldviews, even different ontologies or beliefs about what's real or true in the world. And thinking about how to make decisions in that context is often quite complicated. And so that implicates a lot of what we might now call recognitional equity. So what views or values or perspectives get recognized as being valid or useful in those decision-making processes. We also think a lot about what might be called distributional impacts or distributional outcomes. So I think a lot about when a resource management decision is made, who benefits, in what ways, who pays the costs, and in what ways. And benefits sometimes are economic, so who gets more livelihood options, who gets more fish catch, who gets more trees to harvest, whatever it is. But they can also be things like pride and identity and culture and heritage and tradition and family and all those other values that can be quite hard to quantify, to measure, and definitely can be hard to monetize, to assign a monetary value to. So we think a lot about that. What are the impacts? How do we value those impacts? How do we consider trade-offs? How are those impacts involved in decision-making context? We do a lot of that in the marine environment, which is a particularly challenging and interesting place to do that because most of the resources in the ocean are not private, right? They're public access or public trust resources, or they're common access resources. And so the decisions we have to make about how to access those resources, how to make limits on those resources, are different than they are on land. It's not to say that those decisions on land are easy. Those can be quite complicated, but often we have private property. We have visible boundaries. We can see the impacts when we harvest. Where in the water, we don't have those same kind of boundaries. We don't see those same kinds of immediate effects on fish populations and so on. All of that interest of mine led me to get involved in a panel that Robin kind of briefly mentioned before that I thought I'd share a little insight from. This is the National Academies of Science panel that was mandated by the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And they came to the panel and said, we need help. We'd like guidance on how to inject equity considerations into our resource management operations. They have done that because of a variety of reasons, their own internal motivations, and also a series of federal actions, executive orders that have increasingly required federal agencies to take those kinds of actions. One of their steps was to come to this independent National Academies panel and say, how should we be considering that? What should we be doing? And when NOAA came to us, one of the things that they came with was a pretty tight focus on distributional outcomes. They wanted to know that when they handed out an allocation or a permit or a license to go fishing, harvest resources, was that equitably distributed? Right? That actually proved to be a really challenging question to answer. It's not obvious how to measure that. It's not obvious how to get the data. When the permits and the licenses and allocations were created a long time ago, one, there was no emphasis on considering equity outcomes, and two, there's serious privacy considerations. So we can't just collect all the demographic information that we'd like to have to think about distribution because of those privacy considerations. So we'd have basically no information in most cases about race or ethnicity, age, gender, income, disabilities, any of the other characteristics that we might think of as being interesting to consider from an equity consideration because of those privacy considerations. The panel also pushed back a little on the fact that we should only be thinking and can separate distributional outcomes from those procedural and recognitional things that we're thinking about. So we pushed back on NOAA and saying, you know, we really can't think about who gets what in terms of permits and allocations without thinking about how that was decided upon in the first place. Right? Who got to sit at the table? Whose voices were heard? What power dynamics were at play? Who didn't get heard in that? Whose worldviews and values and belief sets were involved in that decision making, and so on. We ran into a lot of other challenges from the federal government's perspective. One of them is that, as I mentioned, they simply don't know who the underserved communities are because they don't have that demographic information collected in the first place. Another is that they don't have the internal capacity. Many government agencies are simply faced with a lack of capacity to deal with. They have a mandate to do so, but they do not have the budgets or the resources or expertise to do that. So for all of you studying global justice questions and questions about government interactions, I think there's going to be a growth in that because of this push for considering and a recognition that they have no capacity to do so. There's a fundamental incompatibility with, at least for NOAA, with some of their mandate for science-based decision-making and a heavy emphasis on ecological sciences, with questions about, say, indigenous involvement or worldviews or qualitative data usage or anything that falls outside of the sort of commonly understood qualities of scientific decision-making is difficult to incorporate into federal government decision-making processes. I think I'll pause there and switch a little to tools and methods. So that's another thing we talked a lot about, is how to do this kind of research. In my own work and in what we recommended to NOAA, we thought a lot about a suite or a toolkit of approaches. So thinking more beyond use of secondary data to thinking about things like interviews and focus groups and expert panels and other ways of gathering information on some of these issues. Again, there's a challenge with that and the scientific history and mandates and structures that NOAA is using. But that's the direction that we hope the government is going to go. In teaching, you asked a little bit about that, how we involve that in teaching. You know, I think the best way to do that for graduate students is by and through experience with the scaffolding. I think Kay was talking about that before. Helping students get into the field with enough structure so that they can survive and be able to meet the people that they need to meet and to get the contacts and information and context that they need to survive. But enough freedom to figure out how to do some of that work on their own and learn how to do that. In the classroom, we think about trust building within the classroom, a lot of communication and transparency and openness in the classroom to get some of these difficult issues out on the table and discussed. But largely, again, through experience. That's the way I think we've had the most success with students is to get them out in the field, practicing that, doing it over again, sharing their experiences, feeding it back, and so on. I think I'm going to pause there as an introduction. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Olson. I'm an associate professor in art history, and visual studies. I always struggle with describing what it is I do. I think I'm really interested in the intersection of kind of critical humanities and everything else. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But when Sehim asked me to participate in this panel, and I wondered which disciplinary hat to represent. And on one level, I think doing equity and justice work requires being undisciplined. And I think that's specifically true in art history and visual studies, which has its legacies in art history. I mean, the category of art and the ways in which these structures of culture and not culture, the whole field is embroiled in a kind of very difficult debate right now about how it's maintained legacies of colonialism, settler and otherwise, imperialism, how its normativities around embodiment and gender and race really have constrained what constitutes art and what constitutes the canon. And I think it's really an important site to be working, and I think the discipline is very conservative, despite its embrace of radical theories like Marxism, queer theory, et cetera. And I'll talk a little bit about that on recording so my colleagues can hear it later. But I do think this kind of radical undisciplining is important, and I'll return to that because I think it's the hardest thing to think about. I think about it, and I think I resonate a lot with what's been said earlier. I think about equity and justice as practices. I like to ing them, justicing and equiting. I mean, I think they're not ever states we achieve. They're things that we work towards, practices that we enact, and we only sustain through continuing to do so. So showing up, doing the work, questioning and interrogating your assumptions. I'm really touched that Sehim, found my teaching to be interesting and important. I do see I teach a series of classes that are really about taking critical humanities into conversation with, on the one hand, medicine, so a medicine and visual culture class. I teach a class that's an arts practice class that's taking art and aesthetics and the critical humanities into conversation with computer science. And more recently, I've started work on a bioart class where we've been working with colleagues in biology in this interdisciplinary space. And in all of those spaces, I think we encounter different commitments, different literacies. Certainly, I can say in the computer science class and the bioart class, the ways in which the expressive form provides a way into science and computer science as technical domains for people who've historically felt excluded. The number of computer science women and women of color who talk about how they're on a team for computer science, and they're relegated to the aesthetic part of it, right? And to have that be foregrounded, and then have those students who see themselves, largely men, see themselves as technically literate to be grappling with the aesthetics, I think is a really interesting and important thing. So this kind of dealing with literacies. And I've been really struck by how, in that moment, how I've learned and been deeply unprepared, I think, for the kinds of differences that appear. And so the other thing I wanted to highlight is, I guess, the importance of from a faculty perspective, kind of continuing to learn. This idea, I'm dealing with neurodiversity in my classes in ways that I've really, I hope, embraced, but also have challenged a lot of the ways I've done things. And this is all within the context of a biolab that, as Eileen said, this space is not one we just want to embrace wholesale, right? It's hierarchical, it's gendered, so we really want to rethink what those lab spaces are doing. But I think I think you named it, Eileen, this idea of class as community and as a place where you can really work on the ground. You know, these students may never take another humanities class again before they become a physician or what have you. And this perspective of kind of freezing open with time, you know, and in a sustained way, looking at medicine, for example. I know my colleagues in social medicine, they say race becomes like a card you put in your lab coat and you pull it out and you talk, this is your talking points on race, and these things are not, you know, time in these contexts are difficult to sustain. And I do think this question of community not only is in the classroom. The lab model that we embrace is another way to work this through. I co-run a lab that's ultimately about media history and philosophy, and we tinker with technologies as a way to think about media history and philosophy, and that field has a strong legacy of ignoring difference and, you know, treating humans as universals or just not talking about politics at all. And the group over time has been largely graduate students and has really taken on this question of how hierarchy works within the space. And it's been an interesting workshop, a difficult workshop for thinking about all the ways in which power and hierarchies work in graduate education more broadly. And we added an additional complicated layer during COVID of reaching outward to the community, right? So if we're thinking all about coalition building and how might we do that, so we partnered with the parents of African American children in the Durham Public Schools and embarked on a project that was about media literacy, digital equity, teaching students to be agents of their own creation within a popular platform called Minecraft. And it was a deeply humbling experience, both in terms of, you know, how sophisticated we felt we were about these kinds of engagements.
Sorry, that was just the cutest, geekiest way of saying Minecraft.
Minecraft, yeah. We call it Minecraft Block Party. We actually called it Panda Block Party, one of the schools we were working with. But there were lots of ways in which, you know, we ran into then what I think is the other, you know, the structure. So I think equity for me is about enabling and scaffolding people for whom systems and practices are exclusionary, right? And it's largely compensatory. And I think justicing is about dismantling and tearing down some of these structures, right? So one is kind of getting by, and the other one is a more radical project. And I apologize for coming in late, but I did catch the comment about the agreement. I think you brought it up. You know, we had to have parents sign over the intellectual property of their children to Duke University in order for them to participate in a project that was all about scaffolding their ability to self-represent. I mean, talk about problematic. So again, I see this happening in lots of different places, but I think community is key. Community for me is not a happy place. It's frictional, it's brittle, it's agonistic, and it's hard. I think the humanities have a particular challenge. It may be shared, I'd be interested to know, given that we have a long history of critical thinking and these engagement with Marx. There's a tendency amongst faculty to virtue signal and to say, I've been doing this work for a long time, and, you know, give me my gold star. Sahim and Elizabeth can speak to what happened in our Zoom forums, on anti-racist Zoom forums in our department, where there was a presentation and then there was a moment of breakout rooms that brought everybody into horizontal conversation with graduate students, staff, and there was a whole lot of faculty flight at that moment of the breakout room. Oh, my connection broke. Oh, I've got to run, right, and not engaging in that conversation because I think it's vulnerable, being vulnerable and friction. For me, the challenge and what I'm grappling with is what it really means to think about justicing. For me, that's, I have a lot to learn, but what does it really mean to be abolitionist and to think about really dismantling some of these structures, and how do we do that particularly within an institution like Duke? Is it just lip service? Is it rhetoric? And how can we practice rather than preach in that way? So I think that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I'm super excited. I've only been at Duke since July, and for me, this is like a networking opportunity and an opportunity to learn about my colleagues' work and to see who else is really interested in community-engaged research. So thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Anjali Palmquist. I am a new faculty associate professor of the practice at the Duke Global Health Institute. I'm trained as a medical anthropologist and as a biocultural medical anthropologist, and I'm also a clinical lactation consultant. That's a training that I got more sort of mid-career to pursue research on human lactation and breastfeeding. My work broadly addresses perinatal and postpartum and early life, early infant health inequities in the United States and around the world. And this question about justice and equity is a really important one to the work that I do. I will acknowledge in Robin's comment that maybe in public health we've been doing this community engaged work a little bit longer and maybe have more experience. And I would argue that anthropologists have been doing this work far longer than public health folks, particularly applied medical anthropologists and applied anthropologists working in global health, doing all of the things to understand why don't policies get implemented on the ground in the ways that we expect them to? What are the challenges in working with communities to kind of put into place evidence-based practices? So applied anthropology was really that place where we were trying to understand this disconnect between practices and policies and what people's actual lived experiences were and why weren't we getting more community feedback. And so we do have a lot of tools in my discipline for informing the ways that we do more collaborative community engaged research now. And I will say that my discipline also has a lot of problems. There are a lot of really bad practices that have been, there are a lot of us and a lot of us who do different types of work. But what we used to do in applied global health work is now being talked about as implementation research in public health. So all of the methods and the frameworks and the kinds of things you hear people talking about, like implementation, science and implementation research, they're doing basically the same things that we've always been doing to understand why don't these evidence-based practices travel so well, and how do we really get community leadership and engagement into making sure that people have what they need. So the areas of work that I do are really around pregnancy, birthing experiences, and lactation and infant care, so what I'll call the perinatal period. And the kind of community engaged research that I do around this topic is like a matter of life and death for people in communities where they're experiencing disproportionate maternal infant death. And in the United States, I don't know how many of you are aware that we have a massive maternal infant mortality crisis, particularly among Black and Indigenous women and birthing people. And these issues are very much the same in many other countries that have been disproportionately affected by colonialism. So don't have the resources and infrastructure to protect what we mostly regard in the world as a basic human right to have a healthy pregnancy, to give birth in a dignified manner, to feed our babies the way that we choose to feed them, to decide whether or not we get pregnant, to parent in a safe environment. And if these things sound familiar to you, they grow out of a movement called reproductive justice, a definition that was defined by Sister Song. And Sister Song's history, they were inspired by the organizing of women in Africa and across the global south for the human rights to have dignity in pregnancy and childbirth, and brought those ideas here to the United States to advocate for bodily autonomy and greater attention to the care and dignity that we all deserve. So in thinking about equity and justice around reproduction, we think about things like basic human rights, right? The basic human right to get pregnant and have a baby, or to have a baby become a family in whatever way that you choose, right, in a dignified way. You can't have justice without equity, right? You have to have, people need to have what they need. Not all communities need the same things, And so in order to get to the place where we have some semblance of justice, which I would regard for this conversation, a protection of human rights and also protection of dignity in this space, what that's going to look like in different communities is going to be different because of positionality. I also think that we tend to view this lens of human rights and human dignity and equity and justice through much of a legal framework, especially if you talk about human rights at the global level and kind of policies to protect human rights. That really comes out of thinking about the laws that are protecting people's lives and livelihoods and dignity, but not all laws are just. Not all laws perpetuate justice. So there are really important, I think, conversations to have within communities about what does community justice look like. And you mentioned abolition. Right? There are lots of reasons why we may criminalize people in 2023 for ending a pregnancy. But are those laws just? Do they protect, right, the basic right to determine what we do with our bodies and our human dignity? So they're very, while human rights, I think, is a really important, those tools and those frameworks are really important to these conversations, they become complicated, right, when we have conversations within communities and in partnership with community. I'm very much interested in communities' experiences and people within communities, how they experience policies, how they experience inequities. As a medical anthropologist, I'm interested in this intersection between body and society, and particularly around this period of early life, because population health is defined by the health of mothers and babies. It's one of the most important measures of sort of population health and prosperity. Obviously, populations can't survive without healthy reproduction in place. So the orientation to my work has evolved over my career. I draw a lot of my inspiration for the ways that I think about these issues from Black feminist theory, including reproductive justice and intersectionality, and through indigenous methodologies and indigenous orientations to science, and talking about things like epistemic justice and how we become critical about knowledge production. I'm inspired by transnational feminist theories to really complicate how do we think about women's rights and gender and equity in these spaces. I am also inspired by human rights-based approaches because that is the place where a lot of my global policy and advocacy work happens, by really understanding how do we advance protection of human dignity in the perinatal period through human rights-based approaches, and thinking about bioethics and body ethics and body autonomy. When we do this kind of research, when I do this kind of research, it's important to me to understand lived experiences, understand people's stories, and understand the representation of those stories. A lot of the work, I've done work on all across the spectrum of community-engaged research, from community-based participatory research through just collaborative kind of partnerships with researchers from other places. In the teaching that I do, I have taught students who are embarking on a career in global health. And so they're really interested in working in international settings or potentially with immigrant refugee communities in the United States. And so that kind of training, for me, always begins with cultural humility. So we spend a lot of time just doing self-reflection, interrogating our own positionality, thinking about the reasons why. Why do I want to be a global health physician or global health practitioner? And we spend a lot of time on that precisely because the field of global health sort of grew out of a very colonial system, tropical medicine and colonial medicine. And so to begin to do what folks across the world are calling us to do, which is decolonizing global health, really thinking carefully about like understanding what that means and bringing folks' positionality into those conversations. Because when we work across cultural diversity and diverse communities, we're dealing with things like language and communication differences, cultural differences, often working in places where policy environments and social organization and hierarchies may be very different from where folks come from, particularly if they're not doing research within their own communities. And some of the methods that I teach students to do in terms of I used to teach a course called Decolonizing Maternal and Child Health Research, and we survey things like arts-based approaches, looking at indigenous methodologies, really thinking about how do we do this work in community with the people who are going to be most impacted by the work that we do. And I think that community engagement, that call to do community engaged research is really important to me. I'm reminded, I almost always share this quote when I begin teaching my class in cultural humility, and it's a quote from Lila Watson, who's an Aboriginal scholar, who says, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." And that is sort of the ethos that I pursue in my own work, and that I try to get students to think about when they're thinking about their positionality, especially in working across culture and working across difference. For me, I don't see it as like a partnership and collaboration. I see it as like, I am invested. I have to be just as invested in the liberation and the equity and the justice of this work as the people in the community that I'm partnering with. Because for the work that we do, it's about liberation, right? It's not just about publishing papers and about like creating knowledge. It's about how do we get to a place where we actually get to live the human right that we deserve in pregnancy and in raising children in our families. So with that, I will pause, and hopefully we can have some more conversation.
That was so wonderful to hear from each of you, and exactly what I hoped, like bringing these different lenses, and it's so interesting to hear the things that you all share, the challenges you share, the way history informs the present, but also the different ways that you conceptualize it. So thank you all. I think Sehim and I will just share a few thoughts about what we heard and let you all then have the opportunity to respond to each other or ask any questions of one another before we open it up to the audience. But to me, I heard, things that really stuck out to me are the question Eileen asked of what makes a community a community. And you all sort of approach that from a different lens, and I think it's a really interesting question to grapple with when we're thinking about community-engaged research. What does that mean? Who is included in that? I think you also all touched on sharing challenges related to different ways of knowing and lived experiences and the ways that that can be incompatible with science and research and federal governance. And then I also really would love to hear from you when we speak to one another as a panel about, I think it was Mark who asked the question of I would love to hear from the sciences if you share similar struggles with, the histories of systemic suppression and, the maintenance of power differentials that we still struggle with in our work today. And so it sounds like those are shared areas. Sehim, do you want to speak to things?
Yeah, so initially we gave them just 2 keywords, justice and equity, and I was just amazed by the breadth, right, of this multidisciplinary conversation that we were able to hear. And what really struck me out of many things was the keyword abolitionist, because when we were organizing this panel, we posited equity and justice as a working definition, as an ing, right? But also this kind of our attitudes today towards collaboration and community engagement as being like aspirational, emancipatory, and almost like prescriptive approach, right? And so I think critical humanities is like a really important lens to really question like what it means for us to utilize collaboration and community engagement as kind of ultimate good and utopic or kind of prescriptive approach as well. And I really also appreciated the kind of specific examples and teaching practices and research that you all brought in as really positing this embodied lived experience of both students and teachers and their positionalities as knowledge in the classroom and also the class as the community. So yeah.
I want to give you all a chance to respond to one another or ask any questions of one another before we ask any questions or the audience. Do you have anything you'd like to share with one another? You don't have to.
I'll just say that I'm just so wonderful hearing from you and Anjali. I'm just really struck by everything you said, and one of the things about teaching migration and law being unjust is that I've had students in the past say, well, why didn't people just immigrate legally, right? And you're saying, but so the encountering of thinking about, so part of what I think I'm doing with teaching Chinese exclusion laws and stuff like is to say, what do you do when, what are the human choices presented to you and the push-pull factors of migration when you are in climates of, if life is unsupportable in a particular location, but also in other locations the laws are unjust, right? And when other people then turn around and say, but you're just committing a crime, you're doing something illegal. So I love that. I feel like that framework is really important. I just want to say one thing about Grant. I love that that's also your framework in marine biology because journalism 101 that I've taught, in Chinese we say 谁支持谁反对谁得利谁损失 and that's the who supports the every four questions you ask of anything, who supports it, who's against it, who profits and who loses out. So I just thought it was kind of I love how like this is a shared rubric for across disciplines.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you. I think anthropologically, one of the things that we're trained to do is really understand cultural systems on culture's terms, on kind of even, the diversity of different views, but on the terms of what it means within different kind of societies and communities. And what equity and justice is going to mean, I think, is going to be really contextual. It's contextual in terms of like, how you define the communities, how the political economy affects their health, the historical circumstances, and oftentimes how we get to the place where we get to justice is not those through those legal pathways, right? It's these alternative systems, which I think makes this question about like how do we come up with a universal definition of what like common good equity and justice looks like, and maybe that's not really quite the question, because I think it can look different, right, in lots of places.
I thank you all. I mean, this was really rich. I wanted to pick up on what you said about how doing, some of the discussion is around community-based, community-engaged research as the theme here, and I was really struck by how you said, we have to be as invested in the processes of liberation as those communities are, and it's something that certainly I wonder about the ways in which there might be a sense of research refusal that might animate some of this, and it's really hard to talk about within the context of an educational institution. But I think the ways there are deep frictions between the ways in which there are faculty and their research projects and graduate students are motivated to produce in a kind of extractive logic, and the ways in which community sustaining actual justice work has to proceed, right? And that friction is there, and one that I think is at the heart of some of the institutional blockages for. I don't think, yeah.
Quickly add to that. So because I study global Chinatowns and looking at diaspora populations, and I met a French-Vietnamese collector who actually had, he's a storyteller. So he collects stories of fellow refugees, Vietnamese who end up in France, former colony of France. And but he says, graduate students always come to me wanting to write dissertations of my material. And I say, so you get a dissertation out of it. What do I get out of it, right? So, and I remind my students, as they're doing their restaurant ethnographies, like every minute you take of their time is labor and money, right? So what is it? So I've actually added, you can help promote them too. So I mean, even though this is kind of a cheap exchange, but I feel like it's constant reminder that it shouldn't be extractive. But I think you're right. In an institution, basically, it is extractive. That you're always looking for the materials, the collaboration that then you can publish into a paper, and that is a really hard question. I don't know how you all deal with that.
I don't totally have the answer for that, but another challenge that I have faced with mentoring doctoral students in particular who really want to learn how to do collaborative community engaged research around reproduction is that one of the things that we teach is that it's not just like you start from the beginning kind of co-designing and co-leading and then co-collecting data, but you also analyze data together and you write together. And committees, like other professors, don't like that. They want the doctoral student to demonstrate their expertise and competency to write everything on their own. And it's a source of a lot of frustration. I've been successful sometimes in advocating. Like this collaboration is going to be a skill that they take forward in the rest of their career. So why not demonstrate it now? But it's not always. There's a lot of pushback around that too. So that's just like another dimension of what is it that we're preparing our students to do, like beyond their degree, their time here, and if it is community engaged work and like building this collaboration, which I think, kind of maybe want to silo it and say like we'll have like a special place for community engaged work. When you're doing anything related to social sciences or you're engaging with like live, living human people, communities don't have a tolerance for doing things without engagement anymore. Like the reason that we do community engagement around reproductive work is because people are like, you researchers have been so exploitive and you take and we get nothing to show for it. Like our communities are still sick. Like that has to stop. So there's nothing about us without us. It's like a very wide, at least in the spaces where I work. It's like if you're not doing something that's at least engaging with a community, there's going to be that refusal and that like very strong critique of this kind of work.
So I want to go ahead and I know that we have some questions, but I want to open it up to the audience because last time you had plenty of questions and I want to make sure we have the time for it. So I'll walk around if you want to can fall off the stage, just learning that. Does anyone have any questions yet? Okay.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Melissa Karp. I'm a candidate for a PhD in literature, and I'm also the fellow at the Forum for Scholars in Publics this year. So I'm thinking a lot about what all of you are talking about and this question of engagement. And I have, I guess, in some ways a very practical question of the format for what that looks like. I think as academics we're really attached to like the panel conference format, and that isn't always accessible or legible to the communities that we sometimes invite to participate, but then just plop them into our space with no kind of thought as to what else that could look like. And so I'm curious if any of you have had successful or unsuccessful experiences with innovative formats or are kind of developing these other approaches to really facilitate these conversations in a different way.
Should I take a couple questions or should I? Let's just start with that one. Y'all share that mic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can share one example from long-time work with indigenous communities informed by indigenous methodologies. A student went to work with a community that I've been working with for a long time and wanted to use the standard social science toolkit of doing interviews with people and recording those interviews. And the community was quick to push back and say, we're happy to participate in the study, we believe in it, we help co-design it, all of that, but we don't want that methodology. That's not the kind of methodology that resonates with us. Instead, when we have conversations, when we're sharing information, it tends to be in a group format. So knowledge is not held by one individual, it's a collective that people contribute to, and that's more friendly for us. And two, it's bound in motion. So stories are told with a body and expression and often movement sometimes. And so just audio is not sufficient for that. And so the student was able to recalibrate and say, well, okay, I still want the information, but the method, the mode really matters. And so turn to video for that. And so what resulted was a chapter in the dissertation of capturing thoughts, information, ideas, knowledge in a video documentary style. Wasn't easy to do, took time and resources and learning and things, but ended up resonating far more with the community and being more useful for them in the end, because that's something they could use not only for what became part of his dissertation, but for their own purposes and knowledge sharing and archiving of that information down the road. So being flexible, I guess, is the answer.
I'll say something and pass on to. So, Melissa, thank you for that really important point. Actually, part of Story Lab was really recognizing that we really wanted community storytellers. And one of my pet peeves about scheduling on campuses is people scheduled during most other people's work hours. And so one of the things we really, even though my kids were quite little when we were doing Story Lab, but we really made it evenings so that, or lunch breaks times, because that meant people, Duke staff, et cetera, people could participate in a way that they couldn't if you have the 4 p.m. panel on a weekday. Also, if you want NC State and UNC and NCCU participants, you cannot do 4:30 or 5 p.m., right? Because nobody can drive at that time. And so, so a lot of these things that I feel like Duke sometimes gets really wrapped up in its own scheduling without even the pragmatics. Or recently I had a community arts event, and this Peking opera artist toured 30 schools, but we were the only place that scheduled on Saturday, which I insisted on. And there were people who drove from East Carolina U, they drove 2-3 hours, but it was a Saturday, so it could be done. But I noticed that every other stop at every major university in the United States was like Thursday at 4, which meant that you're basically shutting out people. Of course, a lot of local Chinese, older Chinese, community people would want to come to a Peking Opera Legends performance, right? So that's just like a very pragmatic tweak that I often think about in terms of programming.
I think the use of technology is something that is integrated more and more, which is sometimes is a convenience if folks they don't have childcare. And like the work we're often interviewing parents with young children, so sometimes that, like a call or a Zoom call or some kind of convening with technology has been like, we did like a very large sort of COVID-19 listening sessions with different organizations just on Zoom, which yielded some really robust data. I have also, one of the things that we do, which may not be as feasible for you, again, because of the challenges I mentioned earlier, is part of our community engagement often involves capacity building. So we will actually train folks within communities to do the research. So I become like, I'll give you some like instruction on facilitating a focus group, or like this is how we process data together. And there are lots of really innovative tools for thinking about like how people, like we had one project in Nicaragua where the community health workers went out and did interviews. They came back and they we had printouts of the transcripts. They cut them into little excerpts and then like put them all around the room, and then kind of like develop themes together in groups. And it was more verbal, but that was sort of like the way that they were able to process that data together. So sometimes I think that is part of that, like that reciprocal benefit, because then communities who are interested in doing research or engaging in research start to have capacity to lead and design. And maybe some of the answers to the challenges that you have if you are doing community engaged work is like addressing those at the beginning as you're designing your work to see what might be possible. Another example is I was invited to be a community assessment consultant for the Catawba Nation. And what we did was provide some facilitation skills around talking circles, because the focus group interview is not like something they do, it's more about sharing and using arts. We're getting ready to do a national training where we're going to use lots of arts-based approaches. So kind of putting clay on tables and cloth and sewing utensils and musical instruments, and through co-creating art together as they begin to share stories and share experiences, that is how they will come together to answer questions that we pose, like, how do you think that your community is going to receive a home visiting program? So kind of figuring out basically like the ways of communication that that resonate within those communities. So I love the Story Lab approach because I feel like that's really leveraging sort of the thing that we all like to do in good social science and qualitative research, is just like understanding people's stories, right? In a way that's everybody knows how to tell a story.
Yeah, other questions? I'll go here and then I'll go. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eilish Zambilji. I'm a second-year MPP student. I am focusing on climate, food security, migration, and governance. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your time. This has been so wonderful. I have two questions. I'm going to try to make them really succinct. The first is your experiences or your determined best practice for reconciling differences between what we might understand as Eurocentric or white-centric ideations of justice and justice as is determined at the community level or at the individual level within a community that would not fit under the Eurocentric or white category, and what that process looks like throughout research and throughout analysis. And then somewhat connected to this is going back to this idea of academia being somewhat extractive, and the prior panel discussing a little bit the incentives within academia for the types of research produced. As someone who's considering pursuing a PhD but is coming from a policy school and coming from a policy background and work experience, this perceived divide that I've heard spoken about by academics of, well, there are those who produce research and it's just analysis and there's a conclusion section, and then there's research that's produced that produces policy recommendations. And as a researcher, you're looked at in two very different categories, and then you're placed in a specific location depending on if you're someone who produces research and publishes and then is also venturing into this land of putting policy recommendations at the end of your academic research. And how that might fit into the question, Dr. Palmquist, you brought up of a community saying, you're coming in and doing research, but what are we getting from this? What change is happening? And what that looks like for folks in academia, or your own experiences with, is it that we're putting policy recommendations at the end because it's another accountability mechanism, or is that, again, putting it out into the ether? And what is the connection for that policy recommendation to be pursued? And what does that do for a researcher who's now venturing into putting policy recommendations at the end of academic research? So that was maybe 5 questions, but that was my effort at being succinct. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Vidra, faculty at the Nicholas School, and maybe my question segues from your last one, which is, during that first panel, there was a lot of head nodding around barriers at Duke and also like lack of incentives, or that the incentive structure isn't aligned with community engaged research. And I think some of what you all were talking about that kind of hinted at that also got a lot of head nodding, like, And I'm thinking about the evening meetings and the Saturday potlucks and the way that each of you light up when you talk about your community engaged work, which often takes us outside our normal work days and involves a lot of, like investment in people and in relationships. And we really deeply care about this work, yet there's no place, Grant and I were talking about this, like there's no place on your end of year report to put in the time investment and the care investment in the relationships and with your students. And so I'm wondering, what if we thought about the assets at Duke instead of, I always tend to, I'm sorry about this, hopefully my boss isn't in the room, I tend to think about how we screw things up. So if we thought about this place as having incredible resources, what would you suggest we do or start thinking about so that this research is valued and we do harness and sort of transmit the resources of this incredible institution, with our community partners? So.
I'll maybe go for the first one because I haven't been at Duke long enough to be able to comment. Although I've spent time at other institutions, so I have some perspective on that. One first step, I think, in kind of thinking about how do we decentralize and destabilize the Western sort of gaze in research is by reading broadly, reading across disciplines where there is such rich and robust scholarship around how to do just that. Anthropology is one place, ethnic studies, decolonial studies. So there may be just a bibliography. That's what I tell some of my doctoral students. Let's think about how you want to understand this, and then kind of looking at the scholars, maybe not in policy, but in other places, who are bringing in some of these concepts into their disciplines. That might be one way to start, because there are lots of good examples around how to learn to not perpetuate epistemic injustices in the scholarship that we do. For me in my career, I have some work that is not as community engaged as others, so being able to kind of balance my community engaged work with other forms of scholarship that are more sort of standard and get you the places you want to go. But it does come at a cost. I've done a number of really applied, wonderful community-based participatory projects that I couldn't publish anything on because sometimes the governments won't approve of a report that says there's a humanitarian crisis here. So those reports stay within communities and are used by folks on the ground. They don't end up in a journal. And I will say, like, I have a lot of privilege to be in a position where I can sort of balance those things now. But early in my career, you know, it was just, I have some big projects that I got to, you know, get those X number of publications and things. I have a little more freedom now to do that. So just being really transparent about the real practical challenges that there can be in academia, as has already been mentioned.
I guess from a slightly different perspective, I thinking about the question of Duke's resources in relation to the community. I'll cite two projects. One, both involving the media lab that we worked with, but thinking about, you know, within media studies, within contemporary, thinking about precarity amongst gig workers in media industries and things like that has been a site, and we, you know, had research projects engaged with gig economy workers in RTP. And we began to think about the question of doing nothing in the context of research refusal and not trying to, you know, further extract. And the grad students came up with this, but I think it was an interesting case study of the institution's inability to deal with this kind of question. We paid gig economy workers to do nothing. And, you know, part of their billable hours to free them up for the kind of capacity building that they might want for their career. And it broke the invoicing structure of the campus on some level. It's a bit tongue in cheek, but I think there are ways, not necessarily big D Duke, but little D Duke in terms of the people, that there are ways in which the incredible resources here can and are already being mobilized in the services of communities, right? I mean, the ways in which you know, projects can in fact be with care and attention can be used to resource projects in the community that aren't about Duke at all, right? And they're often, I think, strategically not publicized because they get appropriated as part of the PR machine of the campus's outreach and that kind of thing. But I think if we were to audit, there's a lot of resources that go into the community and can be done in subtle ways that aren't about, you know, I think claiming credit on some level at the end of the day. I will also just say about this bigger question about research. You know, I more and more think about capacity building as my work, and it's not about me. And there's definitely things that have happened in my career, promotion. I think it's you know, Duke's hierarchies. You don't get ahead in some levels because of those decisions, but I think they're important. Even as, you know, I know Duke as an institution, I could be elsewhere, and so I'm deeply privileged to do that.
I'll just add one thought on that. Maybe relates to both questions about, you know, looking inwards on what Duke can do and how we as researchers can work to be less or more extractive, hopefully less. Also working with communities on their own capacity to make some of their judgments by themselves. So I'm thinking about IRBs within communities. I'm thinking about protocols, research protocols within communities, guidelines and decision-making structures for communities to think about how to fruitfully engage with the research endeavor before they have somebody showing up at the door, right? So if we're going to collaborate, this is what reciprocity looks like. This is what respect looks like. This is what outcomes look like. If we're going to engage with community, this is the process through which that should happen, right? These are the kinds of people to talk to. These are the time frames we're interested in. These are the groups that might be of interest. that is really empowering to have that material beforehand at hand so that when a community and a researcher are thinking about working together, both sides can come to the table with some structures and thought put into what a fruitful experience can look like. So instead of just looking inward, I think we can look outward too, right? To think about how to help communities do it better as they continue to do this kind of thing.
I was thinking about technology and the fact that this is being recorded, but maybe I'll speak bluntly to that, actually. I mean, you have noticed that Rob and Sahim, and most of us are professors as a practice, right? So I do feel that there is a hierarchy, like Mark alluded to, in the university, where if you're someone who cares about and does a lot of public-facing fellowship, there is a kind of different track. And I do think at Duke is a privilege because, in fact, it allows you to do all sorts of things, and I do think it's a rich private university. There's so many funds to be tapped. So I don't almost feel like money is the issue at Duke, right? Money is not the issue. Labor is the issue, right? Who has time to do the things? I feel like very pragmatic things like Story Lab, I actually, again, kind of funny that's being recorded, but we actually kind of refused to continue running it because Duke kind of changed the structure where they gave us a lot of funding for all sorts of events, but they didn't want to have a staff person be a manager for the lab, right? They wanted us to just give lots of grants to graduate students. I said, one, this is not good for a graduate student's career. The other is like what was talked about earlier is that, there's basically people revolve. You can't count on, you need someone who is a competent manager of the lab. And so I felt like that's the case where it was very strange because it was kind of not about money, but it was also, right? Because they don't want to do fringe, they don't want to create a staff position that then they can't fire or whatever, right? So I'm so proud of graduate students for unionizing, by the way, because you are employees. And so, but I do think that it is very strange that they said, no, we'll just give you lots of money to get lots of graduate students to run the lab. And we're like, no, we're not going to run the lab unless you have someone who's actually employed to run the lab. And so, but we're starting, we're in negotiations now, which is why I say but I think those are things to insist upon at a rich private, right? They have the money, but they have all sorts of complicated feelings about employment. And so that's, one of the things. The other thing I was saying about, I do think academia is often bifurcated, right, in terms of who does teaching and public facing, who does, and so there are different tracks, but I do think it does have to come a little bit from yourself. You have to want to do, like Anjali was saying, you have to want to care about what you do and not think of it only as a kind of TMP or promotional process for it to be a meaningful life, because I've been also on that track, and so I love being here because I feel liberated to be a professor of practice so that I can do a lot of, so I mentioned that she met me on social media. So, that I get to do a lot of things that are meaningful to me, that are public facing. But I think, like the question about labor and then, but it does mean, I would say faculty on this campus who care disproportionately shoulder the labor. So right now I'm on the provost committee for peer evaluation of teaching. So this is something newly spearheaded by Mohammed Noor, and it's a wonderful idea. But as you might imagine, people who opt in to be peer evaluated or also to learn more about their teaching are mostly people who don't need to learn more about their teaching. Does that make sense? The senior faculty who drop out when you have a breakout room are the people who probably need to learn a little bit more about teaching and equity and justice, to be perfectly frank. But you can't compel those people who need it most. I'm sure, in a sense, this is an opt-in, right? You're here because you care. But maybe the people who really need to hear this are not here. So that's my point.
Okay. I'll take these two. And then.
Hi, Minna Silverberg from the Community Engaged Research Initiative at the Clinical Translational Science Institute. Fantastic panel. I was really excited to come to this one, and it did not disappoint. I'm struggling to put my question towards, but I think it has to do with balancing reflection and action and integrating reflection and action. I mean, I think part of the reason I was excited about this panel was because it was reflective, because it was going to debate some issues, right? What is equity? What is justice? There's different ways of thinking about it. And that's obviously part of the appeal of academia in general. I think it can be part of the appeal of community engaged research as well, is because you have a whole new set of sort of questions and challenges and different ways of thinking about things. But another pull to community engaged research is to get stuff done, right? To feel like you're actually helping move the needle on something. And I'm just curious, in your own research, in your own, especially when you are doing something that's applied or community engaged, what techniques you all use to maybe get the balance that you want between action and reflection, and especially thinking, you know, if we take Anjali's point that ideas about what justice is and what we should be working for actually might be different in different contexts and different moments. Maybe they're different from each study. So, right? So how do we not get paralyzed in this kind of debate and move forward while at the same time doing all that good, critical, collective thinking?
I just had a quick, I should have mentioned it in my introductory remarks, but about the filming. So this event is being filmed, and the intention is that afterwards, each panel, the fellows will edit it down into conversation starters that we hope could be used in the classroom or shared more broadly beyond the classroom, to just sort of some of the highlights of each panel. So if there's anything you say that you don't want to be included in that, we are happy to edit it out. But I also wanted to just explain why we are filming.
Thank you. I'll start to respond to your question, Minna. So I think in my experience, the ways of working with communities, it doesn't always look the same, right? And that's sort of why we have the spectrum of what community engaged research looks like, because some communities have just they have much more capacity, infrastructure, time, staff to really be fully engaged. In some of the work that I have done, kind of integrating the reflection piece, is building in pauses and opportunities for reflection, having a system of accountability. So if we start at the beginning saying we want this to be a really collaborative experience, and we want our participation to feel like everybody has a voice and everybody's being appreciated, and that we're sharing power in the ways that, you know, that we describe here. How do we determine if we're meeting that goal? At the middle of the project, at the end of the project, like what could we do better? So sort of building in these opportunities for reflection and accountability, because it's really easy to say, like, we're going to do this justice work and we're going to, you know, be collaborative and put all these labels to the work that we do, and in terms of the ways that we work, but never really have any kind of way to measure or to address issues, to address conflict, to kind of resolve some of those challenges. So I think that's something that I've seen even folks who are on like these big USAID projects and grants sort of really thinking carefully about that piece, like this accountability for ways of working together. Sometimes people they'll have staff, like external folks to come in and facilitate, you know, kind of listening at different phases through the project, and at the end to do some assessment and learning about those ways of working. So those are a couple of things that I've done in my own work.
So wonderful, and I'm glad we didn't disappoint. But that's a wonderful point that you raised, and so I resonated a couple things that Mark said earlier that I really love. One is, and I agree with, which is community is frictional, and so part of what I feel like I'm embodying in my research and teaching, in this case, my research work on Chinatowns, is precisely that I am not speaking for this community, right? That especially. Folks in the academy who work on working class migrant spaces, but share an ethnicity, often feel they can speak for. And a lot of what we want to do is allow for capacity. So to create. So another project I do in Taiwan, founded by dear friends of mine, and my former aunt, and my aunt who's passed away, is letting new migrants, Southeast Asian migrant workers and marriage migrants in Taiwan get published in the newspaper space. But what was interesting is the biggest pushback was actually from academics in Southeast Asian studies, who said the stuff you're publishing is really like grade school level language. But my aunt, Lucy Chan, was very, very insistent that they didn't want to be edited, because part of the point was for submissions, for workers to be able to have a space to see their work published. A lot of them sent them home, saying, I'm not just being a senior caretaker in Taiwan, I'm actually in a newspaper. I think that's really an important part. Like, often the pushback is actually from experts in the field who say, we should be speaking. To me, that's a kind of ethos in my research and teaching, is how to understand the idea of creating capacity, and also not that there should be a harmonious, unified voice that emerges from a community like Asian Americans, which of course come from 65 originating countries and also have the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans within this umbrella called Asian America. And so to imagine that this voice could speak in a singular political or cultural voice is ridiculous. But so community is really just about that temporary negotiation that allows for some policy, some strategy, some tactic to be pushed forward. So I guess that drives both the research and the teaching.